The mountain air was thin, and the wind carried a sound that chilled the bones deep. Booming laughter rolling down from the cliffs. It was not the laughter of joy. It was the laughter of someone who enjoyed the pain of others out below the cliff. In a clearing surrounded by boulders taller than houses, dozens of humans stood inside a ring of rough wooden stakes. The ground was uneven, scattered with bones, broken tools, and the remains of past games. Above them, leaning against a massive stone, sat Grondrak, a giant so large that even when seated, his head rose higher than the tallest tree. Grondrak's skin was the color of ash, thick and rough like stone. His eyes were small compared to his massive face, but they glowed with a cruel spark. In one hand, he held a tree trunk stripped of its branches, using it as a club. In the other, a hunk of roasted meat still dripping fat. Around him, other giants. Lounged, some gnawing on bones, others drinking from barrels the size of carts. They were a clan of 12, and every one of them could crush a man underfoot without slowing down. The prisoners in the ring shifted nervously. They all knew what was coming. The giants game. It happened every few nights. The giants would pull humans from nearby villages or raids. Some were taken for work, some for food. And some, like those here, for entertainment. Grondrak stood, the earth trembling with each step. He grinned, showing teeth the size of knives. "Tonight," he rumbled, his voice so deep it seemed to vibrate in the chest, "we will see who runs the fastest, and who bleeds the longest." A murmur of fear spread through the humans. Two giants moved toward the ring, opening the wooden gate. They reached in, grabbing the first two humans they could catch, a middle-aged man with a limp and a younger boy barely grown. The boy screamed, kicking, but the giant's fingers wrapped around him like iron bars. Grondrak threw his head back and laughed again. "Run," he said simply. The giants dropped the two at the far end of the clearing. For a moment, they hesitated, frozen by fear. Then one of the smaller giants, still twice the height of any man, slammed his foot into the ground. The shockwave knocked both humans forward, and they began to run. The giants chased, but not too quickly. This was a show, after all. They let the humans think they might escape, then herded them back toward the center. A swipe of a club sent the older man flying into the dirt. He did not rise again. The boy stumbled, fell to his knees, and cried. For mercy, there was none. A giant's shadow fell over him, and with one swift motion, the laughter ended in silence. The boy would never cry again. The other prisoners turned away, some covering their ears, but not all. In the far corner of the ring stood Elias. He was younger than the middle-aged man, but older than the boy, perhaps 25, though hardship had carved lines into his face. His clothes were torn, his hands bound in front with rope, but his eyes were steady. Unlike the others, he did not flinch or look away. One of the giants noticed. "This one," the giant said, pointing a thick finger at Elias. "He doesn't cry. Let's see if he screams." Grondrak grinned. "Bring him." The wooden gate creaked open again. Two giants stepped inside, their steps shaking the ground. The others stepped back, not wanting to be too close when the chosen one was taken. But Elias did not run. He did not even step back. He stood still, watching them approach as if measuring the time it would take for them to reach him. When the first giant bent down, Elias finally moved only to tilt his head slightly and speak. His voice was calm, so soft that even some humans nearby could not hear him clearly. "You laugh too much," Elias said. The giant froze, his hand inches from Elias's shoulder. "What?" the giant asked, leaning closer. "You laugh too much," Elias repeated, his voice steady. "But laughter can break." It was such an odd thing to say that the second giant actually chuckled. "Break? How does laughter break, little worm?" Elias's lips curved in the faintest smile. "You'll find out." The first giant grunted and grabbed him anyway, lifting him into the air as easily as plucking a feather. They carried him to the center of the clearing and dropped him at Grondrak's feet. Grondrek looked down at him, his shadow covering the human entirely. "So, you think you're braver than the rest?" "No," Elias said. "I think I'm smarter." The other giants roared with laughter. This was the boldest thing any human had dared say in years. Most humans begged, cried, or tried to run. Not this one. Grondrek leaned closer, his breath hot and smelling of meat. "Then show me. Prove your smartness. Survive my game." Elias glanced around at the burned-out torches, the piles of discarded bones, and the high stone walls of the clearing. His eyes paused on something, a large basket filled with dried wood and oil, hanging from a chain above the giant's feast table. He said nothing, but in his mind, he counted the distance. Grondrek straightened. "Run!" But Elias did not move. "I said run." The giant's voice cracked like thunder. Still, Elias stood. "No, I'll only run when I'm ready." The giants laughed again, stomping their feet. They thought this was another way for a human to try and look strong before dying. Elias looked up at the hanging basket again, then back at Grondrek. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "When I run," he said, "your laughter will stop." For the first time that night, the giant chief's smile faltered, just slightly. The night was darker now, with the stars barely visible behind the thick clouds. The camp was quieter after the first round of the giants' game. Fires burned low, and the giants rested, their heavy breathing shaking the ground. Elias sat apart from the other prisoners, his wrists still sore from the ropes, but his eyes sharp. Around him, the others whispered stories of despair and defeat. Most had lost hope. But Elias did not speak. Instead, he watched. He studied the giants carefully, how they moved, where they placed their weapons, and the way their eyes flicked to every shadow. A young woman named Mara sat beside him. Her face was pale but strong. She looked at Elias, her voice low and trembling. "Why don't you stop watching? It's useless. We are their playthings. They will never let us go." Elias smiled faintly, his eyes not leaving the fire. "Watching is the first step to knowing." Mara shook her head. "Knowing won't save us. The giants are too strong." "But they have weaknesses," Elias said softly. "All giants have." Mara looked at him skeptically. "You think you can find theirs?" Elias nodded. "I don't just think. I know." The prisoners were surprised by Elias's quiet confidence. No one had dared speak like that before. As the giants snored around the camp, Elias stood and walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing. The air was cold, and the trees rustled in the night wind. He knelt and looked around. Near the edge, there was a pile of broken branches and dry leaves. Elias began to clear away the debris carefully. He found a small metal shard, half buried in the dirt. It was sharp but light, too small to be a weapon for giants, but a perfect tool for a human. Elias smiled to himself. "This is the first spark." He slipped the shard into his torn clothes and returned to the prisoners. Mara watched him closely. "What will you do with that?" "Wait and see." The next day, the giants were loud and cruel as always. Grondrek's booming laughter echoed through the camp as he threw another human into the ring, but Elias did not flinch. Instead, he spent his time watching. He noticed where the giants stored their food inside a cave guarded by two giants, but the entrance was narrow. He saw where the weapons lay, near a pile of rocks. Most importantly, he watched the hanging basket filled with dried wood and oil above the giant's feast table. It swayed gently in the breeze, hanging from a thick chain that looked old and rusty. Elias's mind raced. That basket was dangerous. It could burn the entire camp if it fell. That night, the giants gathered around the fire to celebrate their victories. Their laughter was loud, but Elias saw their eyes flicker with something else: carelessness. He moved quietly toward the feast table, careful not to wake the giants. With trembling hands, Elias pulled the metal shard from his clothes and slipped it between the links of the rusty chain holding the basket. It was a small act, but a dangerous one. Suddenly, a sharp sound, the chain creaked loudly. Two giants stirred and looked around, their eyes narrowing. Elias froze. His heart pounded like a drum, but the giants soon returned to their feast, their laughter rising louder than before. Elias slipped back to the prisoners, his hands trembling with excitement. The next morning, the giant camp was alive with tension. Grond roared with laughter and announced a new game, this time a race through the rocky ravines near the mountain. 2 humans were pushed into the starting line. Elias watched silently, waiting for his moment. As the race began, the giants chased the humans with their usual mockery, but Elias was not running. He stayed near the cages, watching the giants carefully. Suddenly, the chain above the feast basket broke with a loud snap. The basket swung wildly and crashed down, spilling fire and oil over the wooden table. Flames erupted instantly, sending smoke and screams through the camp. Giants shouted and scrambled, their laughter dying into panic. Elias smiled faintly. His small spark had started a fire. The giants rushed to put out the flames, but chaos had spread. In the confusion, Elias moved quickly to free the ropes binding the prisoners. One by one, the humans began to slip out of their cages. Mara ran too. Elias, her eyes wide with hope. "You did it," she whispered. Elias nodded. "It's only the start." The giants were angry and confused. Grond roared orders, but the humans were already running toward the mountains. The giants chased, but Elias led the way through narrow paths only a human could use. The giants struggled to follow. Behind them, the camp burned. The humans were free for now. That night, Elias sat on a rocky ledge, looking down at the burning camp. Mara joined him, her face full of wonder. "Do you think we can escape?" she asked. Elias looked at the stars. "Not just escape. We will change the game." And somewhere far below, deep in the mountains, a giant's laughter had fallen silent. The dawn was slow to rise over the mountain camp. The fire's glow faded into thin smoke drifting through the trees. The giant's feast table lay shattered, blackened by the flames Elias had set. The camp was in chaos. Giants growled, shouting orders that echoed among the rocks, but their laughter, the loud, cruel laughter, was gone. Grond, the giant leader, stood taller than the tallest pines, his massive fists clenched tight. His face was twisted not with anger, but confusion. For the first time in decades, the giant's roar of laughter was silent. His eyes searched the shadows, searching for the human who dared to defy him. The other giants gathered around him, some nursing bruised ribs, others fuming with rage. "Lost face," one giant growled, slamming a huge fist into the ground, making stones jump. Grondrak's voice cut through the murmurs like thunder. "We find that human," he said, his voice cold, "and we show him what fear means." Far from the burning camp, Elias crouched in a narrow crevice between 2 cliffs. His breath came slow and steady. The metal shard he carried glinted faintly in his hand. Behind him, he could hear the distant rumble of giants searching. Their heavy steps shook the ground, but the mountains were Elias's home now. He had learned the paths and the secret caves as a child. Before the giants took him, he glanced over at Mara, who was tying a makeshift bandage around her arm. Her face was streaked with dirt and soot, but her eyes shone with hope. "We can't let them catch us," she whispered. Elias nodded. "We won't." The giants moved in a pack, their footsteps echoing through the ravines. Their laughter was replaced by growls and shouted commands. The chase was on. Elias led the group carefully, knowing every twist and turn. The giants were too big to follow the narrow paths he chose. As the sun climbed higher, the chase grew tense. The giants howled in frustration as they stumbled on loose stones and broke through thick bushes. Suddenly, Elias stopped. He pointed to a large rock perched precariously above a narrow pass. "If we can trigger a landslide here, we can slow them." "Down," he said. Mara looked up at the rock. It looked unstable. Elias handed Mara the metal shard. "Help me wedge this under the rock." They worked quickly, pushing and twisting the shard into the crack. Behind them, they heard the pounding of giant footsteps getting closer. With a loud crack, the rock began to shift. Elias shouted, "Now!" They ran as the rock crashed down, blocking the path with a thunderous roar. The giants behind them were caught off guard. Some were knocked down by falling debris. Grondrak bellowed in rage, shaking his fist at the sky dot as the day wore on. Elias and the freed prisoners pushed deeper into the mountains. Their hearts pounded with fear and hope. At night, they camped in caves, whispering stories of freedom and revenge. Elias taught them how to move quietly and how to use the shards they had found to make small weapons. The humans were no longer prisoners. They were rebels. Back at the ruined camp, the giants gathered around the feast table once more. The chains that had held the basket were broken. Grondrak's eyes burned with a new fire. "We will hunt the rebel human until he falls," he promised. The giants sharpened their weapons and prepared for war, but Elias had other plans. One evening, he sat alone on a rocky ledge watching the stars. His mind was already moving ahead, thinking of ways to fight back. For the first time, the giants had felt fear, and that fear was the first crack in their laughter. The mountain air was cold and sharp, cutting through the trees like a blade. The sun hung low behind dark clouds, casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs and narrow ravines. The giants' camp was a smoldering ruin far behind them, but the danger was not over. Far from the comfort of fire and laughter, Elias and the freed prisoners were running for their lives. The giants were angry, furious. Their voices boomed through the mountain passes as they chased the humans like hunters after prey. The ground shook beneath their massive feet, and every snap of a branch or roll of loose stone told Elias the giants were getting closer. Elias's heart pounded, but his eyes stayed calm. He led the group with sure steps, guiding them along paths only a human could know. The narrow trails twisted through thick bushes and steep cliffs, impossible for the giants to follow without risking a fall. Behind him, Mara ran, her breath coming fast but steady. She kept looking back, fear in her eyes. "They're still coming," she said, trying to sound brave. "We have to keep moving," Elias replied. "If they catch us in the open, it will be the end." The prisoners were tired, their bodies weak from months of captivity. Some stumbled and fell, but Elias and Mara helped them up quickly. Every moment counted. The giants shouted and cursed as they forced their way through the forest. Their great hands ripped branches and crushed rocks, but the narrow trails slowed them down. Some giants fell, bruised and scratched, but they kept coming. One giant stopped suddenly at the edge of a cliff and growled, "Too narrow, we can't follow there." Grondrak's voice thundered from behind. "We don't need to follow. We will trap them at the bottom." The giants moved back, blocking the lower paths and waiting. Elias saw their plan clearly. The giants hoped to force the humans into a trap where they could crush them easily. He had to find another way. Elias led the group higher up the mountain, into rocky caves and dark tunnels. The air grew colder and the paths harder to follow. The giants struggled to climb, their heavy bodies slipping on the stones. The prisoners began to feel hope. The giants could not keep up forever. One night, Elias stopped near a small stream. The prisoners drank deeply and rested. "We can't run forever," Mara said quietly. "What is the plan?" Elias looked at the glowing water and smiled. "We fight. But we fight smart." He showed them the metal shards they had found, now sharpened into small blades. "We will use these. They are small but sharp. We know these mountains. The giants do not." The prisoners nodded, their faces lighting with new courage. The next morning, Elias set traps along the paths. Simple traps, loose stones tied with vines, pits covered with leaves, and noisemakers made from sticks. When the giants arrived, They were caught off guard. One giant fell into a pit and roared in pain. Another was blinded by a shower of stones. Grondrek snarled. "These humans are clever." The giants grew angry and fought harder. The chase became a dangerous game, with both sides testing each other's strength. And one afternoon, Elias led the group to a narrow valley with steep cliffs on both sides. He stopped and faced the prisoners. "This is where we make our stand." They nodded, ready. The giants arrived, their faces dark with rage. Grondrek stepped forward. "You will not escape." Elias raised a shard, his voice steady. "We don't want to escape. We want to end this." The giants laughed, but there was an edge of doubt. The battle began. Elias and the prisoners fought fiercely. The small blades bit into giant skin, surprising the huge beasts. The humans used their speed and knowledge of the land to avoid crushing blows. Mara knocked a giant to the ground with a rock. Another prisoner used a sharpened stick to poke an eye. Grondrek roared in fury and charged. Elias. The two met in the center of the valley. The giant's fist swung like a hammer. Elias dodged and struck with his shard. The giant grunted, surprised. The fight was not over. As the sun set, the battle slowed. Giants and humans alike were tired and wounded. Grondrek looked at Elias with a new respect. "You fight like no human I have ever seen." Elias wiped sweat and blood from his face. "This is only the beginning." That night, both sides retreated. The giants returned to their ruined camp. The humans found shelter in a cave high above the valley. Elias sat by the fire, thinking. He knew the giants would return stronger, but he also knew that the laughter of the giants was no longer unbroken. The game had changed. The morning sun barely touched the rocky peaks as Elias and the group gathered near the edge of a high cliff. The air was cold and thin, and the sky stretched wide and empty above them. Below, the giants' ruined camp lay hidden among thick trees, a dark scar on the land. Elias looked at the faces around him, tired, bruised, but alive. They were no longer prisoners. They were survivors, fighters. And today, they would strike back. "We can't keep running," Elias said, his voice calm but strong. "The giants are powerful, but their strength has limits. Today we make our move." Mara stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "What's the plan?" Elias reached into his torn jacket and pulled out the sharpened metal shards. "We use what we have, our speed, our knowledge of the land, and these small weapons. But more than that, we use the mountains themselves." The group nodded. Hope stirred in their hearts. Elias led them through narrow paths carved by rivers long gone. They moved quickly but carefully, avoiding the open ground. As they approached the cliffs, Elias stopped. "Here," he said, pointing to a large boulder balanced on a thin ledge above a steep drop. "If we can push this rock down, it will block the giants' path and crush many of them." The group looked up. The boulder was huge, larger than any giant could easily move. Elias smiled faintly. "But we don't need to move it by hand. We just need to make the ledge break." He handed the metal shard to Mara. "Help me wedge this into the cracks," Elias said. They worked quickly, slipping the shards into the rock's cracks, prying and pushing with all their strength. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the earth. The boulder shifted. Elias shouted, "Run!" The boulder broke free and crashed down the cliffside, smashing trees and rocks as it fell. Below, the giants were caught by surprise. Many were crushed by the falling stone. Grondrek roared in fury and pain. "You think you can stop us?" The survivors rushed forward, their hearts pounding. The giants fought back with fury, but the humans used their traps and the mountain's dangers to their advantage. Elias moved through the battle like a shadow, striking quickly and disappearing. The giants were strong but slow. The humans were small but fast. As the fight wore on, Elias found himself face to face with Grondrek. The giant's eyes burned with rage. "You are brave, human," Grondrek said, but bravery will not save you. Elias held his ground. I'm not brave, he said quietly. I'm determined. The two circled each other. Grondrek swung a massive fist, but Elias ducked and jabbed at the giant's knee with his shard. The giant stumbled, surprised. Elias pressed the attack, darting between the giant's legs, cutting and dodging. Grondrek roared and raised his club to strike. But Elias grabbed a fallen branch and swung it into the giant's ribs. The giant howled in pain. The battle turned. The giants, now wounded and tired, began to retreat. Elias and the others pressed forward, chasing them from the valley. That night, Elias sat by the fire with Mara and the others. They were tired but alive. We did it, Mara said softly. Elias looked at the burning sky. This is only the beginning. He knew the giants would return. But now, the giants knew the humans could fight, and that fear would change everything. The mountain air was still and cold. No laughter echoed through the valleys anymore. The giant camp, once filled with roaring voices and cruel games, was now quiet. The fires that had burned so brightly were only faint embers, slowly dying in. The night. The giants sat around their broken feast table, their faces grim. Grondrek, the leader, looked older and heavier, his skin marked with cuts and bruises from battle. He stared into the fading flames, his eyes filled with a strange silence. For the first time, the giant's laughter was gone. Far above, on a rocky ledge, Elias stood alone. The cold wind whipped through his hair, but his eyes were steady. Around his neck hung the small shard of metal that had started it all, the first spark of rebellion. He looked down at the ruined camp below. The giants were beaten but not broken. Yet their silence was the greatest victory of all. Mara approached quietly, sitting beside him. We did it, she said softly. Elias nodded. Not just survived, we changed the game. The prisoners who had been freed gathered around Elias that night. They sat by a fire, sharing stories of hope and loss, fear and courage. The bond between them was strong now, built on the fire of their shared fight. We will never be prisoners again, Elias said. We are free. The others nodded, their faces lit by the fire's warm glow. But freedom was only the beginning. Elias knew the giants would return. They were proud and powerful. They would not forget the shame of defeat. He began to plan, not just for survival, but for peace, a way for humans and giants to live without fear. Days passed, and the giants stayed in their camp, silent and watchful. No longer did their laughter fill the air. Instead, they watched the mountains and waited. Travelers who passed nearby told stories of a lone man walking the rocky paths with a quiet smile and a sharp blade. He is not like the others, they said. He carries the fire of hope. One evening, Grondrek called the giants together. We are strong, he said, his voice deep and steady. But the humans are clever. We cannot fight them with brute strength alone. He looked at the faces of his clan. We must change too. Back on the ledge, Elias heard the distant sounds of the giants moving. He stood tall, ready. The mountains were silent, but the future was loud with promise. The war was over, but the story was just beginning. One human had challenged the giants and silenced their laughter. And now, a new voice was rising, a voice of courage, change, and hope.